Hi, I'm Jacqueline.
And I'm Courtney, and this is Caffeinated Crimes.
So we just got back from CrimeCon a couple of days ago. We've been talking about it for months now.
Mm-hmm.
So we spent 3 days, 3 days in Orlando, and it was wonderful. We had a really, really good time. If you're ever considering going to CrimeCon and you're able to go, please do. It was so well
Mm-hmm.
done, very respectful, very impactful. Got to see a lot of amazing speakers and meet a lot of really cool people.
Yeah, it was a really great time. All the sessions were really great. Um, Everything was just really fun. And if you, for some reason, want to listen to an hour and 45 minutes of us detailing every session we went to, you can go to patreon.com/caffeinated crimes. And we have a whole, or if you just want to look at like the pictures and the
hmm
session titles and like the three sentences I wrote, that works too. But yeah, it was really, really great. Got to meet one of my favorite podcasts, Affirmative
hmm
Murder, and they were super sweet, super nice. Got to meet Paul Holes and take a picture with him. Um, Got to hear just a lot of, speakers, a lot of like experts in the field and victims and victim advocates and everything like that. So it was just a really good time.
Yep. So, and we are already signed up to go next year. So
Yep.
stay tuned for that to be on the lookout for all of that information. Yeah, so it is a longer episode. We usually record our two-parters back to back, but because of CrimeCon and life and things just being busy, we weren't able to do that this time. But I don't think there's been any updates that I'm aware of since we recorded last, Courtney.
I'm sure there are, but I do not know them at this moment.
Okay, great. None that we are aware of and prepared to cover at the moment. So our sources, obviously, again, this is a two-parter. So if you have not listened to part one of Barbara Mackle, please do so. It gives a lot of important information that you'll need for part two. So,
hmm
um,
But if you want the just TLDR, she's kidnapped. She's in a box underground. There has been a ransom, and the Miami police have recovered the ransom that was supposed to be taken. If you just
yes.
maybe forgot in the last week, that is like the I just summarized an hour episode into like 15 seconds.
I mean, we did say that we're going to try to start putting our content on TikTok. So I think you nailed the first one, Courtney. Perfect.
Yep. Thank you.
Yeah, so we left off with they thought the drop had gone well because the money was gone, but then they got a call that the Miami police had the money. So, how did they get this money? Where is Barbara? What's going to happen to her? All that stuff we're going to get into. Obviously, sources are the same as last week's episode. So, just listen there if you have not. Again, you should have already listened. Anyway, good start. Okay, so basically, a county deputy had been out patrolling the area where the causeway was at about 4 a.m. when he noticed a blue Volvo station wagon with Massachusetts plates in a parking lot. And remember, that is the car that we are looking out for. So he did patrol this area often and he'd never seen it before, but he thought it kind of like looked out of place because he was there so frequently. But he was technically out of his county jurisdiction because he was just checking on a friend's property in that area as a favor. So it's not like this was an area he was supposed to patrol, but you have the night shift, things are a little slower. So he would just swing by where his friend lived. So now he sees this, but he can't really do anything because it's out of his jurisdiction.
Mm-hmm.
So he immediately called for backup from the Miami City Police. So the Miami City police officer arrived and they both look inside the car and they see suitcases, like clothes, just a lot of clutter. So they wait a while and they eventually see a man approaching. So police tried to approach him, but he quickly started running away and pulled a weapon on them and started shooting. He was able to get away, but left behind a suitcase full of money, a duffel bag containing a pair of slippers for skin diving, a snorkel, goggles, a steel tape measure, and two flashlight batteries.
What
And
is skin diving?
I think I'm gonna talk out my ass. Hold on. I think it's like scuba diving, but
Okay.
like,
It sounds bad.
not as deep, you know what I mean? And that,
Yeah, like just
I
like
just
the
made that up.
surface. I mean, with all those things, it sounds like it, but
Yeah, so skin diving refers to a mix of snorkeling and free diving. A skin diver spends more time at the surface, like kind of looking down at things.
hmm
So kind of more like snorkeling, but like you can dive a little bit. Does also say that it is an antiquated term, which makes sense because this book was written in the 70s. So
Okay. See, I'm just asking the questions in case people are listening and they're like, what does that mean? You know?
Yes, yes. And thank you to Jennifer who messaged us to let us know that they used crank calls in the 80s in Ohio. So there
Hmm.
are people out there using both. So,
Yeah. Like both those terms just seemed like older terms that have then
mhm.
evolved into like newer terms for
Yeah.
just whatever reason.
Yeah. I mean, I know nothing about skin diving either way, so I'm just like, yeah, sounds like something people do. Great. Type it up. Perfect.
It just sounds bad. Skin diving. I'm diving into your skin, you know?
Yeah, that
Just
is a little, I didn't really think about that. That is true. So everything in the bag was all wet, and the duffel bag did have the name Ruth Eisman stenciled in white. So they immediately took the money to the police station to be cataloged because they didn't want to be accused of stealing any of the money. And the book went into this long, deep dive about another kidnapping for ransom case that had happened within a few years before this one. And I guess the police that recovered the money kind of recovered some in their own pockets.
hmm.
And so that happened pretty recently before this case happened. So they were like, we are taking it immediately back to the station. Like, I don't want there to be any chance that they think that we took this money too.
Yeah.
So also a neighbor nearby heard a boat idling outside of his house early that morning, and a Boston whaler boat, which Courtney, I don't know, is just a kind of boat. I'm sorry. Was found
I'm just
abandoned.
curious, okay?
I'm just saying, I don't know boats. It's a kind of boat, I would assume. Was found abandoned near the causeway. So, when an employee for the University of Miami Institute of Marine Sciences arrived to work at 7:15 a.m., he noticed that the Boston whaler was missing and someone had broken into the gas cabinet where they fueled the boats. So the employee was able to identify the boat that had been abandoned as theirs because there were some specific characteristics. And so police are wondering at this point if the kidnapper had stolen a boat to try to get away. So the FBI retrieved the money from the Miami police, and U.S. Commissioner Edward Swan signed a search warrant for information related to the found Volvo with the Massachusetts plates. So they quickly found out it was registered to George Deacon, who was an employee with the Marine Sciences Department of the University of Miami, and he had been previously employed with MIT or the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And the car registration also had a Boston address. Inside the car, the FBI found a motel room key for room 153 at the Roadway Inn in Decatur, Georgia. There were also indentations left on some papers that matched the first few sentences of the ransom note. A Yellow Pages book was inside, and the pages with contact information for the Catholic churches was torn out. They also found ski masks, tape, shotgun shells, a bottle of xylocaine hydrochloride, I think, hypodermic needles, men and women's clothing packed in separate suitcases. There was also a checkbook at Key Biscayne Bank for George G. and Dorothy Deacon with an address for a Miami trailer park. There were also 3 different passports for a woman named Ruth Eisman Shear, including one from her home country of Honduras. So we got a lot of circumstantial evidence in this car
Hmm.
and a lot of identifying information. So this was a pretty
Yeah.
big moment. So a student ID card and paperwork allowing Ruth to be on the grounds of the Marine Lab after hours also confirmed Ruth's status as a graduate student in the Marine Sciences Department at the University of Miami. She also had another student ID card for the University of Mexico, and there was evidence that she had previously lived in Washington, D.C., including a library card, a membership card for Young Women's Christian Association, and a bank book with a D.C. address. She also had a Florida beginner's driver's license that listed her as 5'2" and 115 pounds, so a very petite person, as we have mentioned throughout the whole first episode, that this pair that they're looking for. And a second bank book from Miami showed that her remaining $500 in her account had been withdrawn 9 days before. So, as if they didn't have enough evidence in this car, the FBI also found one-way plane tickets for A. Post and G. Deacon to leave Friday, December 20th at 7 a.m. to Chicago and then Las Vegas. There were also a variety of other random objects such as cameras, bulbs, film, electric testers, which I don't know what that means. I assume it to be some kind of not like bomb making something, but like something to test electricity for different components of something
Hmm.
along those lines. Um, earplugs with wire, a salt shaker, an alarm clock, and an imprint stamping device for the Office of Registrar of Vital Statistics that could be used to change a date of birth. So, like, there's so much happening in this car.
Yeah.
There were also several photographs. Some consisted of Deacon and others aboard a sea at ship. And there was also a nude photo of Deacon wearing a policeman cap in bed and a photo of Ruth in her bra and underwear. There were a few others of them like dressed but in a house. And then finally, the first photo of Barbara with the kidnapped sign like under her chin where her eyes had been closed. So if you'll remember from part 1, they told her to retake the photo because they had to prove that she was alive. So they needed her eyes to be open. So they found this first photo that was not used. So FBI agents across the country start trying to figure out who George Deacon and Ruth Eisman Shear are and why they would want to kidnap Barbara Mackle for ransom. I'm also not sure if Ruth's last name is pronounced correctly. I could not find a single like video other than like a YouTuber who, you know, just kind of like us. So I don't really know where they would have gotten it from either, but they pronounced it Shear. It's Scheier. So that's what we're going with, but just wanted to put that disclaimer in there. So records showed that George Deacon had been hired on June 1st, 1968 as a research assistant at the University of Miami for $8,000 a year. His age was listed as 23, and he claimed to have graduated from high school in Alaska in 1958, and then Northeastern University in Boston. He attended Northeastern University in Boston for the 1967 to 1968 school year. So obviously this timeline is not really like matching what his age is listed as. He also said he was working as a foreman for Research Associates Cordilleras Road in Redwood City, California, for a salary of $10,000 a year, but he would have been 15 years old at that time, and also $10,000 a year at that time would be about $115,000 today. So I don't really think he was working as a foreman at 15 years old, making the equivalent of $115,000.
I really hope not, or he's been breaking today's child labor laws for a long time.
Yeah. So it was clear that the university had not thoroughly reviewed his resume when they hired him, but his employer was really happy with him. He was like, he would do a task like when needed. He didn't need additional information. Like he learned quickly. You would just tell him what needed to be done. He would do it correctly. They did say he was very blunt and straightforward, but they appreciated that. So Deacon had moved out of his Miami apartment after only 2 months because he learned that 2 police officers lived there and he didn't like that. So that's when he moved to the trailer park instead. And colleagues remembered that he didn't like having his picture taken, but they didn't really think that was too odd. You know, a lot of people don't like having their picture taken. So Ruth also arrived at the University of Miami in the summer of 1968. She had applied to the graduate school but had not yet been accepted, so she and her mother showed up in person to meet the administrators, and they did decide to accept her to the graduate school after this visit. Her mother told the school that Ruth would be receiving a fellowship from the Pan American Union in D.C., where she worked as a research biologist in their Department of Academic Affairs. She also had a master's degree in pharmaceutical chemistry and had previously attended Mondino School of Languages in D.C. to become fluent in German and French. Her native tongue was Spanish, and she spoke English fluently as well. So Ruth moved to Miami and rented a room from a friend of a secretary at the school. And she did start struggling academically, and her professors and colleagues started to doubt her qualifications. When a professor spoke to her about her poor grades, she said that she hadn't been feeling well and was going to start studying harder. Colleagues recalled her telling extravagant lies for just no apparent reason, like nothing that, you know, really mattered or would be relevant. But they're like, yeah, like she would just tell this like super elaborate story and then admit that she made it up. And they're just like, okay, why?
Yeah.
So Ruth and Deacon met on the John Elliott Pillsbury, which was the Marine Lab's largest research vessel. They sailed out on September 23rd with several research missions. And during their research trip, the group spent a long weekend in Bermuda. So Ruth didn't know how to ride a bike, and Deacon offered to let her ride on his with him, and this kind of sparked a romance between the two. The ship returned to the Port Everglades on October 7th, which was 10 weeks before Barbara was kidnapped. And one of the professors on the ship recommended that they kind of keep their romance low key. They're like, this is kind of frowned upon, like, you know, you work together. So they were seldom seen together after returning. Like they did kind of take that to heart and try to kind of keep it hidden. And it wasn't very well known that they were a couple. The FBI was able to find out that Ruth had never actually completed the fellowship application and was therefore paying her tuition and books out of pocket. And her friends remembered her mom being very demanding and often writing her letters, asking for money and like other things that she wanted Ruth to buy her and like mail back to her in Honduras. One of the examples they mentioned was like a $500 pool, which like I don't know what kind of pool you're buying that you can mail for $500 in the 1960s, because
Yeah.
that would be like, I don't know what the exact amount is, but a whole lot, like
Oh,
$500 for like a little pool right now is a lot of money. So I can't imagine what kind of pool
yeah.
she's mailing her.
Yeah.
So after gathering all of this information, the FBI started asking around at the Marine Lab and found out that no one had seen Ruth or Duncan since Friday, December 13th, just a few days before Barbara was kidnapped. It wasn't unusual for Deacon to be absent from work, and Ruth had said that she was going to spend the holidays with a friend in Jacksonville and will be back on January 5th. But she did leave gifts for her landlady and her granddaughters before leaving town. The Miami Herald put out another ad on behalf of Robert Mackle, stating that he had nothing to do with the Miami police showing up at the drop site and that he had cooperated fully and would still cooperate and bring the money again if they didn't hurt his daughter. So FBI agents set up at airports, train stations, highways, like everything all across Miami. They went to Deacon's trailer and learned that he had a wife named Dorothy and two sons, Adam and Vince, who were 2 years old and 8 months old. So the three had flown to California on Friday, and neighbors recalled Deacon just like constantly building things. Like they even had to ask him to stop because he was making a lot of noise in the middle of the night. And one neighbor told the FBI he actually ran into Deacon on Wednesday, which would have been the day after the kidnapping. And he said that he almost didn't recognize him because he had shaved his very distinctive beard. Deacon said that he was going out on the ocean with the university and would be out of the country for 6 months. And he mentioned that he was going to park his Volvo at the airport. And the neighbor told him like that'd be super expensive. Like, can you imagine how much airport parking is for 6 months?
For
So,
real.
yeah. So Deacon asked if he knew anyone that would be able to use it while he was gone and said that he would leave him the keys. The neighbor thought that he was more talkative and friendlier than usual because he was usually quiet and kind of kept to himself. And also at the trailer, the FBI opened a Christmas card that his wife had sent him in Florida. So I'm going to whip out my trusty book and read you all this letter again.
Teacher Jacqueline's back out.
What?
Because last time you read from the book, you said you felt like a teacher getting your book
Oh,
out.
I
So I
didn't hear
said
the
Teacher
first word.
Jacqueline.
That
The
just said
Teacher
like,
Jacqueline's.
that just like eat your Jacqueline back out. And I was like, I'm so confused right now. But I promise this one is not nearly as long as the first letter that we read. So basically she like started out just saying that, oh, like we had a nice flight, the kids are adjusting, blah, 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 but then goes on to say, quote, by the time you get this, you should be well on the road to wealth and excitement and glory. Remember you asked me if you couldn't go to bed for excitement? My first thought is, isn't it exciting with almost every member of the opposite sex? My second thought is yes, but only because it is forbidden. If everyone were a criminal, you'd probably find the good Christian life exciting. I accept what you are attempting. Personally, it is not my way. I don't find social orientation exciting, like flashy cars, clothes. Of course, if there weren't anybody like you in the world, it would be a lot less exciting. No one has been around yet asking questions. The airplane ride was fun. I'll be reading and listening to the news. Good luck, be careful and brave, and don't let the bastards wear you down. You're the only man I know who can do it. So I think clearly she
Okay.
had some insider knowledge about Deacon's plans here.
Mm-hmm.
So letters and telegrams from across the country arrived in support at the Mackle's house that week. And on Thursday, December 19th, an envelope arrived at the Mackle house with the Polaroid of Barbara and the sign saying kidnapped under her chin with her eyes open. The envelope also contained Barbara's ring. At 5:15 that afternoon, Father Joseph Bian at the Epiphany Church in South Miami received a phone call from a man who said he was the kidnapper and had seen Robert's pleas in the newspaper. He said he believed that Robert had nothing to do with the Miami police and that he shouldn't worry because Barbara was okay. He said she was buried, but she had air through a battery, but he couldn't say the battery would last another 24 hours. He also asked him to get Robert's personal phone number and that he would call back at 11 p.m. for that number. So, like Frank Mackle, the priest said the man seemed very like calm, cordial, again, just not like you're communicating with this like violent man.
Mm-hmm.
So the FBI arranged for the Epiphany Church's phone to be tapped as well. The FBI recounted the money and placed it back inside the original suitcase because now the new one they had purchased might be needed for evidence because they knew that, they had handled it and everything. And Father Bien got the Mackle's phone number and everyone waited for the kidnappers to call again.
Charles Gillian was driving home from work on Thursday and listening to the news when they mentioned the Miami police intercepting the kidnappers and the blue Volvo station wagon with Massachusetts plates that was recovered. So the evening before, he'd stopped at the thrift store on the way home because he often bought old TVs and repaired them to sell. And a man and woman were outside in a blue Volvo with Massachusetts plates trying to sell their trailer. So it was like an old U-Haul trailer that attached to the back of their car and had a bunch of stuff in it. So the thrift store would only accept donated items and wouldn't buy anything from anyone. So the couple was just sitting outside, just waiting to see if anyone going to the thrift store would just buy it. So they're like, well, they're not going to buy it from us. So maybe someone coming in will.
I mean, it's a good thought because you're like, oh, people are coming here to find cheap stuff, find used stuff. Maybe somebody wants this stuff too. I'll just wait here in the parking lot.
So they told Gillian they were moving to Boston and had to sell all of their stuff that wouldn't fit. So the inside of the Volvo was already packed with stuff, and he asked how much they wanted for it, and the man said 50 or 60, but Gillian offered 35, and he accepted it because they're just like, just take it at this point.
You're doing us a favor.
Yeah. So he also tried to sell him a shotgun, but Gillian said he didn't need that. And so when he got home and started going through the trailer, he saw it had scuba equipment, lab equipment, a tape recorder, what appeared to be electronic equipment for bugging phones, and newspapers from that week in Atlanta about Barbara's kidnapping. There were also letters written to a man named Gary Stephen Kritz in prison from his mother in Sitka, Alaska. I hope I said that right, Alaska. So there were also other letters dated later from the same woman, now addressed to George Gary Deacon. So those letters warned him the police had been looking for him. And at 10 p.m. on Thursday, Gillian contacted the Miami FBI office, and 2 agents were at his door within 10 minutes because clearly they're getting more leads about who these people are.
Yeah, anything related to this case, they're like, yep, we are on the way right now.
We're here. So now the FBI had the name Gary Stephen Christ. So they reached out to the California office to search for that name. So Gary Stephen Christ was born on April 29th, 1945, and had escaped from prison in California in 1966 and was currently a wanted man. So at 16 years old, he served a year at the Utah State Industrial School for theft, and he was given an IQ test while there and scored 142, which did rank him as a genius. He went to prison at 18 years old for 7 car thefts and burglary. So starting out young with his crime. And he escaped once by faking stomach pains and then escaping from the hospital, but he was found and rearrested. He then escaped again by sawing through his cell bars with a cellmate after leaving dummies made of their clothes in their beds. So this sounds a little too Shawshank Redemption for me, but
Yeah.
A guard caught them climbing over the fence, and the other man was shot and killed. But Christ jumped the fence first and was able to escape. So the FBI sent over the fingerprints they had from George Deacon's car and confirmed that George Deacon and Gary Christ were the same person. So now we know, he has a fake identity, which makes sense why his resumes didn't line up and all of that.
Yeah.
So the FBI finally knew who they were dealing with. And at 10:35 p.m., the phone rang at the Church of the Little Flower instead of the Epiphany Church. So Father Mulcahy, sorry again, answered again, and the caller said he had spoken to him earlier about an important matter. And the father said he remembered him. He'd actually stayed up late in the common room in case the kidnapper decided to call back. So he was like, I'm staying up just in case he's calling back.
Because remember, he wasn't supposed to call that church. He was supposed to call the other one. So he wasn't even oh, I know he's going to call at this time, but he's like, just in case, I'm going to be ready,
Yeah, I bet he had a epiphany that was going to happen.
Wow.
Okay. Anyway.
I'll give you a laugh for that one. It's okay.
So the man gave the priest directions for where Robert should go this time to deliver the money. So the directions were much simpler this time and didn't involve like all of the theatrics of the ransom note. So Father Mulcahy kept asking the caller to repeat each direction in an attempt to keep him on the call as long as possible, but it was only about 3 minutes long, and so the FBI wasn't able to trace it. So since the last call said they would call the Epiphany Church at 11 p.m., they decided to wait until after 11 p.m. just to make sure like no other calls are going to be received before they left with the money. So they're like, let's just hold on a minute just in case. It's like, because I guess whoever's calling the church the Little Flower could be fake too, like could be false. So they're like, let's just wait just in case.
They're like, I mean, he contacted him before, but also he's been pretty specific so far with like what he's asking and what he's doing. And he said he was going to call this other church at 11. So maybe let's just wait, 20 minutes and make sure that's what's happening.
Yeah. And since the new instructions didn't specify that Robert had to be the one to deliver the money, they decided Billy Vessels would be the best person to do it because he wasn't as emotionally distraught as Robert was. Because if you remember from the last episode, Robert really struggled like with delivering this money, kind of freaking out he was going to do it wrong. Like it was very stressful for him. So they're like, if they didn't specify it had to be Robert, let's put this other guy in.
Yeah.
So Inspector Schroeder hid in the back seat of the car under a blanket, and they left the Mackle house at 11:25 p.m. So they arrived at the location a few minutes after midnight on Friday, December 20th. It was very foggy out, and when they arrived, they were startled by a car parked facing them with their headlights on. So Vessels got out of the car, left the suitcase in the middle of the road, and left. So FBI agents circled around for like half an hour later and confirmed the suitcase was gone by 12:30 a.m. So someone had taken the ransom money.
Yes.
At 4 a.m. on Friday, the news released that a man named George Deacon and a woman were wanted on suspicion of kidnapping Barbara Mackle. So a secretary for the Deltona Corporation heard the news and remembered that in November, a man named George Deacon had called and asked for their annual report to be mailed to him. So this annual report included information about how well the company was doing financially, which I didn't know that you could just call up a company and get this information. Like, okay.
Right. I'm like, is it still, I mean, I guess you can like Google them now so you can find all of that information. So I guess back then, like you could just ask to read their financial report. Okay.
Yeah. All right. So the FBI also received calls from several people that seen Chris and Ruth around Miami during the last few days. So Ruth was seen several times at Florida Bible College where she was wearing torn and dirty clothing, but then was later cleaned up and wearing different clothing. An employee of the airport called in that a man using an ID for George Deacon came in on Wednesday and bought plane tickets under the name Schultz. He later got a refund for those tickets after the failed money drop and said that he and his wife were in an accident on the way to the airport and she was in the hospital. So
which also, I just have to add on here that he got the refund after the flight had taken place. Like he like came in after and was like, oh, this is why I missed the flight. And like he got his refund. And I'm like, can you imagine today trying to get refunded for a flight that took off that you missed? Like you can't even get refunded for flights that are canceled.
Like, I know, right? I feel like you would have to like show so much proof, like so many, like, because like I know I've heard before people who are like can't make flights because of like death in the family or whatever, but they make you provide like the death certificate and shit. Like they make you provide like proof.
But I feel like with those two, you still have to have like travel insurance that you've purchased like for that. You know what I mean? Like I think you have to have an extra travel insurance. Like I don't think the airline would just automatically refund you even today for something like that. And obviously he had like no documentation or anything. And they're just like, oh, so sorry, Mr. Schultz, here's your refund for you and your wife.
Yeah. He was able to buy plane tickets under a fake name. But I know like
exactly.
Yeah, like if your flight is on time and like leaves, like there's a very rare chance that you're going to get anything for that. So only helps if they delay it. Then you can sometimes get a you can start changing it without the extra fees, but so the December 20th plane tickets for G. Dinkin and A. Post were found inside the sold trailer. So the FBI believed that those had been the original getaway tickets, but Christ had bought earlier ones when the money was ready earlier than expected, but then had to cash them in when the money was intercepted by the Miami police. So the FBI started going around to all car rental agencies because they knew Christ needed a car like to get away somehow now that his Volvo had been impounded. Like they're like, he has to have some form of transportation now since he has no car. He didn't make his flights. So an employee with Merlin Rent-A-Car recognized the photo of Christ and said he rented him a lime green two-door 1969 Ford Fairlane at 4:30 Thursday afternoon. So the FBI issued an all-points bulletin to all police stations across the country with the car description and the description of Ruth and Christ. So they were also able to track down a cab driver who said he'd given Christ a ride to the rental car company and that he was limping and said he'd been in a car accident and needed another car. So the FBI received another lead when a call came in from Jackson Memorial Hospital emergency room. So they had treated Christ on Thursday evening before his identity had been made public. So he had arrived at 6:23 p.m. using the George Deacon identification. He said he had a laceration on his private area and an abrasion on his knee. He told the nurses he fell into a hole and landed on a pitchfork. He wasn't seen by a doctor until 8 or 9 p.m. The doctor put 5 stitches in the groin and also noticed that he had a fungal infection. So he told Chris to come back in 8 days to have the stitches removed. Chris told him he would be on a boat for work then, and the doctor gave him a small suture kit and kind of showed him how to like take the stitches out himself. So that way he, would be able to do it when he's supposedly on this boat. The FBI suspected he'd actually cut himself while hopping a chain link fence when running from the Miami police. So on Friday morning, the FBI went back to the Marine lab to ask about Christ. They asked if he could have possibly built a fiberglass box while at work. And his supervisor said it was often part of his job to transport specimens and that he did have to create boxes for them that would be sturdy and waterproof. And in the previous weeks, he'd been asking around about building a sturdy waterproof box and needing a fan that would run on a battery for underwater cooling purposes. A colleague was able to help him find one that they used like very little current. After these conversations, the FBI is like, okay, we know Barbara is like really being held in a box buried underground somewhere. And they also really know it's Christ and Ruth. So
yeah. Like just evidence after evidence after evidence in this case.
Yeah. So finally at 12:47 p.m., a little over 12 hours since the money had been received, 23-year-old Trisha Poindexter answered the phone at the Atlanta FBI office. The caller told her he had information on the Mackle girl. So Trisha tried to switch him to an agent, but the man said he would only give the directions to the capsule once. So the information about Barbara being buried hadn't been released outside of the immediate investigation. So Trisha didn't even know what she was taking notes about and initially didn't really understand the significance of this phone call. So she doesn't know this is a big deal.
She's not understanding that the capsule is literally Barbara. She's just like, oh, okay, you have some information. I'm sure they're getting tons and tons of tips from people with all kinds of random information. So she's like, okay, cool. Capsule. Okay, where are we going? All right, whatever.
Yeah. So she took notes of the directions the man provided to a remote area 22 miles northeast of Atlanta and then shared the message with Agent Don Tackett. And agents immediately took off in that direction. So the directions weren't super clear. So agents were going in all directions at the points where they weren't sure where to turn. So they were like, okay, it says turn left, but we're not sure if it's here. So you go and then I'll go here, just anything they can do.
Just spreading out everywhere. Yeah.
They finally found a property owned by an Atlanta physician that matched the description the caller had given. A house had been torn down and there was junk and old cars everywhere. So they started to worry because it was approaching 4 p.m. and they knew it would be dark soon. Again, this is December. We know the sun sets at 4:30 by that time. And they knew it would be much more difficult to search when it got dark. If Barbara really had been buried alive with a battery-powered fan for air, time was running out to save her, and they didn't know if it was already too late and Barbara was already dead. So now we're going to go a little bit backwards in time and back to Tuesday and back to Barbara. So when Barbara realized no one was coming to check on her and she was truly alone. So, we kind of mentioned that she counted the seconds and she knew no one was coming. So this is kind of what happened since then.
Mm-hmm.
She once had a teacher who described a man surviving mental torture by imagining building a brick house around himself to protect himself. So Barbara's version of this was to imagine different scenarios in which her family was notified and was on the way to save her. So she would pretend they received the call, they're gathering the money, and they were just like on the way to get her. So when too much time had passed and she realized it wasn't going to be that simple, she invented like plane delays or traffic or trouble getting like the money, anything that would just like take more time. And she would start the scenario over again in her head. So as soon as she like played through the scenario, realized they weren't here, she'd start back from the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
She also sang happy songs, including Christmas carols, out loud to keep herself busy and sane, and imagined decorating her Christmas tree ornament by ornament. So at several points, she thought she was going to die anyway, so she might as well just turn the fan off and get warm and sleepy versus suffering for however long it would take. At times, she also had to turn the fan off for a little bit because it was so loud. I mean, you're in a small box. I'm sure this fan is sounding super,
Yeah.
super loud. But then she would also make herself turn it back on again when she started getting too warm and worried she wouldn't have enough oxygen. So she estimates that 4 to 5 hours after she was buried, the light flickered and then went off, and she was now in complete darkness for the rest of the time. So the light flickered, went off, it never came back on.
And if you remember from part one, like she was afraid of the dark anyway. And so she kept turning it on to just kind of like, okay, calm down. And then she would turn it back off because she knew she needed to save the battery. And now it's like, now you don't even have that option. Like you are in complete darkness. You're not going to see anything.
Yeah. So she started searching around for the tranquilizers so she could sleep, but she wasn't able to find them. She did find some apples and bread, but only ate a few pieces of the caramel candies. She wasn't hungry and also didn't want to worry about having to use the bathroom and the box. She finally drank some water to make sure she didn't get too dehydrated, and she had to suck very hard through the tube to get the water to come out, and it tasted terrible. So at one point, she accidentally pulled the tube of the water jug, and because the water jug was at her feet, she had to bend her body in a weird angle to reach it and to put it back inside. And she kind of had to feel around for a while because, again, it was pitch dark, but she was finally able to get it. Then her body got stuck in that position for about a minute until she was able to get straightened back out. So Barbara was 5'8", and the box wasn't long enough for her to stretch her legs out all the way. Her nose was still stuffed up, and she had to breathe out of her mouth the entire time. Something wet was dripping from the lid, and the blanket and mat she had were both wet. And after about a day, she did have to pee, and there was a bucket, but she had to like lie a tray underneath her body, pee a little bit, transfer it to the bucket, and then do it again because she couldn't sit up and like sit on the bucket because the box was just too small. So she kept spilling on herself, and then she would get even more wet. Barbara had previously thought of herself as agnostic, but she started praying to God and felt comforted. So Barbara didn't know how long she'd been in the box when she heard rustling outside. She started pounding as loud as she could on the lid of the box, and FBI agents heard something and started looking in that area. So Barbara was afraid she just like imagined the rustling, like it's been a few days, like I'm just hallucinating. But she just kept banging anyway, just in case, because like, what do you have to lose? And an FBI agent then saw some red dirt underneath some leaves. Inside, Barbara heard a man yell, "Barbara Mackle, this is the FBI." They told her to keep knocking if she could hear them, so she did. And they were able to speak through the hole that led to the fan to ask her if she was okay, and she said she was. The agents immediately called for backup and started digging with their bare hands. And they also searched the junkyard and found buckets and just anything they could to like dig more quickly since they didn't have like shovels, just anything to get her out as quickly as they could. So they finally reached the box and saw the lid had been screwed shut. So they found a tire iron in one of the old cars and used it to pry the lid off. And at 4:32 p.m. on December 20th, they opened the box and Barbara saw light for the first time in 83.5 hours. All of the FBI agents were crying as they lifted Barbara out of the box.
Barbara tried to walk, but her knees immediately gave out. I mean, obviously she's been like laying in this box for almost 4 days.
Yeah, I bet
And
your
she's
legs are so stiff from like not even be able
yeah,
to stretch them out, like so uncomfortable.
exactly. And she's also like been sick and running a fever this whole time and everything. So they carried her through the woods to the car, and Barbara told them they were the handsomest men she had ever seen. Which I'm like, yeah, girl, tell them.
That is literally a sight for sore eyes and like practice. You know what I mean? She's like, this
She's like,
is, you're
wow,
beautiful.
you are
I could kiss
amazing.
you.
So they showed her pictures, and she was able to identify Gary Christ, aka George Deacon, and Ruth Eisman Shear as the man and woman who had kidnapped her. So agents took Barbara to Agent Donald Cochran's house because he lived the closest. So basically, they're just like, we got to get her somewhere. Like, I mean, I guess I don't know why you wouldn't go straight to a hospital, but I guess they just wanted to
Mm-hmm.
take her to his house, somewhere comforting. So a doctor did meet them there to examine Barbara. She was very weak and dehydrated, but in okay physical condition considering. She told them that she had not been sexually assaulted, like she didn't need that type of examination. And Cochran's wife helped Barbara take off her gown and take a bath. And they also gave her their daughter's clothes to wear, and then they gave her a Coke and some homemade soup. So they're just like really taking care of poor Barbara.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and FBI Director Edgar Hoover himself was the one to call the Mackle home and tell them that Barbara had been rescued and was safe. So, like, just again to show you the magnitude of this case, that Hoover
Mm-hmm.
himself is like on the phone, like, hey, we got your daughter. It's okay.
And probably the only good thing J. Edgar Hoover ever did.
True.
The only good thing.
True. Barbara rested in bed and was able to talk to her family on the phone. And her dad always joked about like how much money he spent on her. And so the first thing that she said to him was, I told you have an expensive daughter. So like she was just like throwing out the wisecracks here.
I've been playing this scenario in my head for 83.5 hours at this
Right.
point. I've got all the jokes lined up.
Yeah,
I've
she's
just been
like,
waiting.
I know what I'm going to say. I got him. I got all the great responses. So the Deltona Corporation plane flew the Mackle family to Atlanta immediately. So a boat dealer in West Palm, which is in Florida, called the FBI a few minutes before 4 p.m. on Friday afternoon and told them that he had sold a boat to a man with a Miami car rental who purchased the boat for $2,300 in cash, all paid in $20 bills. So this is a very large amount of money at this time, all in $20 bills. They're like, something a little suspicious here. And he did provide them with the man's license plate number, and the FBI arrived at the boat dealer shop within minutes. So the boat dealer told the FBI the man had arrived at about 8:30 that morning looking for a fast boat for jet skiing. He signed the title application as Arthur Horowitz of Fort Lauderdale, and he provided his draft card as identification. The boat dealer told the man it would take 2 to 3 hours to prepare the boat, and the man told him that he had to go buy some camping equipment and would come back. So they then went out on the boat just after 2 p.m. to like test everything out, make sure he was sure that he wanted to buy it. So the man asked if there was enough gas in the tank to get him to Bimini. So after he was sure that he liked the boat, he paid the full $2,300 in cash. And the boat dealer's son was actually the one that was like suspicious and was like, maybe this is Barbara's kidnapper. Like what is happening? Like everyone is looking for this person. Things are a little odd. I don't know. And the boat dealer wondered why a man from Fort Lauderdale would come up to West Palm to buy a boat when he could very easily buy one in Fort Lauderdale. Like it's not like it's some like specific boat that only he would have or, whatever. So he felt something was off and he contacted the FBI. So the FBI was able to trace Chris' movements through West Palm that morning. So he checked into the Dixie Court Hotel at 9:30 a.m. and paid with a $20 bill. He was only in his room for about 15 minutes and then left to return the rental car to the same place he had rented it from. He also asked them to hold it for 10 days and paid a deposit. And FBI agents were able to locate it at 6:35 a.m. the next morning. And when they searched it, they found the empty suitcase that had previously held the money. And they were able to determine that Chris made the phone call to the Atlanta FBI from Dixie Market. So the U.S. Coast Guard was sent out to look for the boat that Chris had left in. They first thought he had traveled the ocean, but they were finally able to determine that he had gone through the Okeechobee waterway, like all the way across Florida, like versus going, out and around. He's just like going straight through.
Mm-hmm.
So basically there's several like locks throughout the state. So you're like cruising along on the water, and there's like a gate that's like, you got to stop here, and you like fill out your information. They're like, okay, cool. And then they let you go through this next section, and then you come upon another one, and then the next section, and so on and so forth.
Kind of like water tolls. I don't know if they had to pay,
Yes.
but kind of like that, where you're having to
Yes.
stop, you know.
That is a perfect way to explain that. Thank you, Courtney.
I got you.
So they did have to like fill out like their name and address and stuff like that. Obviously at this point, nothing's like electronic, so you're not like immediately receiving that information. You're just gathering up all your paper forms. So Chris had passed through several of these, water tolls throughout the night and had written his name as Horowitz each time, but he did use a different Fort Lauderdale address on all of the forms. And by the time the Coast Guard and the FBI put this together, he had already made his way across the entire state of Florida this way. At 10:30 a.m. on December 21st, a helicopter spotted what they thought was Chris' boat in the Atlantic Ocean at the mouth of the Caloosahatchee River and San Carlos Bay. So local deputies gave chase in their boat, but a bailing plug broke and they had to stop. And so the helicopter continued monitoring Chris' location. As they were closing in on him, he swung his boat to an uninhabited island called Hog Island, which ironically, Robert Mackle had once owned Hog Island, which is just such a wild, like, how did this happen?
Yeah. Weird.
Yeah. So while the island wasn't very big, it did consist of like a very thick jungle. So there's plenty of places of hide, like very difficult terrain to kind of like move through. So Chris immediately started running and disappeared into the jungle at 12:05 p.m. The nearest island was about 1.5 miles away, so they didn't think that he could easily like get away, but finding him on the island would be difficult. Soon, 85 agents arrived to search the island, and before long, 300 men and 11 bloodhounds assembled from various law enforcement agencies to join the search for Chris. So you got like 311 to 1 here.
Yeah. Hopefully you're finding him.
I hope so. So FBI agents recovered the money on the boat, which totaled $479,000. So he's used, about 21,000 of it so far.
Which is like so much money.
Right.
If you think about, I mean, I know he like bought the boat and the rental car and all that, but I'm like, even today,
for 21,000 in like a day,
$21,000 in a day is absolutely insane. Insane.
Yeah. And still don't know what else on, unless he just like had that money on him. I don't remember if I talk about that later. Maybe he just had some money on him versus in the boat. I don't know.
He's like, I'm getting a nice steak dinner
on this Hog Island where no one is.
I know.
So unfortunately, like the search had to shut down when it got dark because again, like this type of area, it's very difficult to search. They don't have enough light. But Richard McLeod from the Charlotte County Sheriff's Office and Milton Buffington, one of the local dog handlers, heard some splashing just after 11 p.m. So they basically decided to like move slowly towards the source of the splashing so they can like kind of cut him off. So they're like coming in from like one side of the island as he's kind of like leaving that side. So they're kind of like, I don't know why I'm doing hand motions. This is a podcast. I want to make sure Cordy understands. I don't know if you guys do, but they're kind of coming in like perpendicular so they can like cut him off.
Yeah.
But this did like take some time because they're moving. I mean, again, like you're in water, like you're going to make noise, like you're on this uninhabited island. You're going to hear every little sound. So they're like very slowly moving along. And then finally at 12:10 a.m., they were able to shine a light in the direction of the splashing, and they saw Chris crouching about 10 feet away. They told him to put his hands on his head and took away his sheathed hunting knife and handcuffed him. Chris responded that he had rights. And so McLeod actually had to like pull the Miranda rights card out of his wallet to read them to him because he's probably like, man, I don't do this shit. Like, he's like, I'm not used to all this. Okay, what is this? Let me make sure I get it right. And Chris was very thirsty and asked for a drink of water, and the deputy told him to drink the swamp water, which I thought was funny, so I had to include it.
That is funny. He's like,
yeah, there's plenty of water right there. Go ahead.
Go right ahead.
Yeah. So on December 28th, Ruth Eisman Shear was added to the FBI's 10 most wanted list and was the first woman to ever be on that list. And the only information they had is that at 10 a.m. the day after the failed money drop, Ruth went into an architect firm in Miami and asked for a taxi to be called. She told them that she had been out on a boat with some friends and decided to go home. Her cab arrived at 10:30 a.m. and she asked to go to the Greyhound bus station to go see her aunt in North Carolina. So she got out of the cab at about 10 minutes before 11, and FBI agents didn't think that she had actually gotten on a bus because they had agents waiting at the bus station, like looking for them. But they also knew like it was possible if they just didn't recognize her. She also had a bank account in Washington, D.C. with $655 in it that hadn't been touched since June. They did keep a close eye on this bank account. They also contacted every acquaintance of Ruth they could find in the months after the kidnapping, including those in Mexico and Honduras. So the trailer that Chris had sold to that man did have an empty box for 2 walkie-talkies in it, and one of them was found in the bushes in a Miami neighborhood, so the FBI put out information in the local newspapers asking if anyone had seen the other one. And on February 20th, 1969, an 11-year-old boy found the other walkie-talkie in a vacant lot about 150 yards from where Ruth had last been seen. On January 10th, Ruth's mom wrote a letter to Barbara saying that Ruth had had a tough life and asking her to forgive her. She explained that Ruth's father and baby sister had both died and that she had taken care of her younger blind brother his whole life until he also died at 18 years old. She also said that she didn't think that Ruth would ever hurt anyone. And the FBI wondered if Ruth had been in the car with Chris after the money drop because they found 2 Burger King coffee cups inside the rental car. They did think it was possible that Chris had murdered Ruth. So after his capture, Chris was taken to the hospital and fell unconscious in the car due to dehydration, exhaustion, severe mosquito bites, and this is not okay by today's standards, but FBI agents confirmed his identity by the stitches in his scrotum. So he's unconscious
they were just,
and they're just
pulling the pants down
yeah, did a quick little peek and they're like, yep, this is our man for sure. He was logged into the Dade County Jail in Miami at 4:47 p.m. on Sunday, and it was noted that he was to be held for U.S. Marshals, and his bail was intentionally set at $500,000, which I thought was a nice touch.
Yeah, a little nod,
Yeah. So Chris began talking to some of the FBI agents who guarded his cell. He said he didn't know where Ruth was, but that he wouldn't tell them if he did. He said that she should be free while she can and then serve her time if she's ever caught. He did share that they had talked about going to South America together, and every time he talked, he would refer to himself in the third person as the kidnapper. So he's like, the kidnapper is irrational in certain situations, and he tried to prevent this by putting together careful plans ahead of time. He also said the kidnapper panicked and the fatigue led him to make mistakes. He admitted that he shouldn't have used the cash to buy the boat. He also spoke about himself in general, and he's like, my genius IQ makes me egotistical and exaggerates my schizoid personality. He said he had hallucinations and violent tendencies as a child. He thought he might be insane, but that he did know right from wrong.
Sounds like he's trying to really detach himself from it.
Yeah.
The kidnapper, not me. The other me.
Yeah, the kidnapper. But they did say every now and then he would slip up and say I instead of the kidnapper. So it's very obvious. But yeah,
we see what you're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So as he started to open up more, Chris said that he had murdered 4 other people. He said the first was a 56-year-old gay man that he pushed off a bridge when he was 14. He said the second was a 19-year-old girl in California who said her dad would kill him when he found out what he did to her. He said he got scared and he punched her in the stomach, pushed her down a ravine, and then choked her and left rocks on top of her body. He said in 1961, he murdered another gay man after escaping from the Utah State Industrial School, and he wouldn't say anything about the 4th victim, which led agents to believe that he was talking about Ruth. And so he's like, oh, and there was one more, but I'm not going to say anything about that.
Mm-hmm.
So the FBI looked into death records for areas that Chris claimed to live in at the time of those murders. So 56-year-old Anton H. Simonson was a halibut and salmon fisherman who had been found face down in a creek bed in Pelican, Alaska. So he was originally from Norway and had last been seen drinking at a local tavern. He'd been drinking a lot and he got tired and decided to walk home. And when his body was found the next morning, his hands were clutching his chest, and the town nurse assumed he died of a heart attack, and so no autopsy was conducted. So this is a very remote town in Alaska in the 50s. So I guess they don't have any kind of, medical examiner or anything like that. It's just the town nurse that she's like, well, yep, probably a heart attack because he's clutching his
Especially if
chest.
you don't see any like stab wounds,
Yeah,
shots. I mean, it is Alaska. He's been drinking. He kind of,
exactly.
walked off. I'm sure it just happens. And I'm sure there's a lot
Yeah.
of cases like this.
Yeah, and I'm sure they didn't see a lot of murders in that area
Hmm.
either. So it probably like you said, unless it's an obvious like stab, gun, something like that, they probably wouldn't even automatically think that.
Yeah.
Um, which he did have $171 in his wallet, and it was missing when his body was found, but that could also be someone that just robbed his body. Like that doesn't necessarily mean that they should have known, that it was a murder. And Christ and his parents had rented an apartment several islands and 100 miles south of Pelican, but they did often fish there while living on their boat. And no one was able to confirm if they had been staying in that area when Simonson died. So we don't have any proof that he did this.
But
It's
it does
clearly
kind
he,
of line up
yeah.
because, I mean, it would be weird for him to be like, I did this and like kind of detail it. And then
Hmm.
they do find someone who died of whatever. You know what I mean? It'd be kind of
Yeah.
weird for him to get those details almost like exact.
The book did mention like if he's just, seeking attention and stuff like that, like maybe he heard about this and maybe it really
That's
was a heart
true.
attack, but like in his brain he twisted around into like, oh yeah, like I remember that guy and I'm gonna say that I pushed him off the bridge. And so they didn't really know
Yeah.
which it was.
Hmm.
Also, the body of Helen Ann Crow was found on October 3rd, 1964, south of San Diego. She had been badly beaten and was underneath a pile of rocks. So, again, very specific circumstances here. However, Christ had been an inmate at Dual Vocational Institute more than 400 miles away for the 11 months prior to her death. So, seems
Hmm.
pretty unlikely that this was him. But also,
This
like,
could be another one where like he
mm-hmm,
hears an inmate talking about it who possibly did it, and then
yeah,
he's like, "That was
definitely.
me." He's
Yeah.
like taking it on, but pretty weird.
Yeah. I mean, I'm also thinking too, like he escaped a bunch of times from a bunch of places. I'm like, did they
That's
really
true.
know? like how on
Yeah.
top of it were they, And I don't know, that maybe
And
not
she was
accurate at all.
found on October 3rd, 1964. But
Yeah.
how, like, do we really know how
And it
long she'd been
didn't,
dead?
because that's the thing, like it didn't specify how long she'd been dead, but they did make a point to say that he had been in this school for 11 months. So it's not like, oh, he was there like at the time she was found. It's like, oh, well, he could have killed her before. Like they made sure to point that out, but they also
Hmm.
didn't say, and I don't know how accurate. I feel like when you get into that many months, like you could tell based on
Yeah. I
that
mean, I feel like Southern
decomposition,
California
but
is pretty warm too, but
yeah,
I mean, this is the 60s. I don't know if they
yeah,
knew really anything about decomposition. This is long
exactly.
before Dr. Bass opened the research facility,
Hmm.
like a long time before like understanding body
Yeah.
decomp.
Yeah. So just wanted to include her information just in case. Either way, someone obviously murdered this woman. So not really sure if it was him or not. Also on July 27th, 1967, the Nevada Highway Department found a fully clothed skeleton of a man 10 miles west of Wendover, Utah. His estimated time of death was between 1962 and 1964, and Christ had escaped the industrial school in 1961. So he could possibly be responsible for this murder if the time of death was off, which again, when you're looking at
Hmm.
like years, 1 year is not really a big difference, you
Yeah.
know. So the FBI learned that the real name of Christ's wife was Carmen Simon Christ. She was 22 years old. So basically, she told the FBI that she knew who her husband was when she married him. She never fully admitted that she knew about the kidnapping, but it was very implied. She spoke a lot in hypotheticals. So she's basically like, so Christ would have used the social register to select a victim and find an address and would have driven around several houses deciding on one. He would
This is
also,
like OJ Simpson. Like, if
yes,
I did it, if I
exactly.
did it, this is what I would have done. Like,
Yeah.
okay.
Yep. So she said that he would have seen a college insignia on the window of a car to tell him where the victim was living. So also just a side note, because I'm like, what the hell is a social register? So basically it had names and addresses, like clubs that families belong to, their children's names, the colleges they went to, just like community information, about like these people. So it would be very easy to
Hmm.
pick a prominent and wealthy family in the area based on that information. Like if you see the schools that someone's going to, the clubs they belong to, things like that, like you can start to get an idea. I mean, driving by their house, you can start to figure
Yeah,
out
and
that
then
they have money.
and like narrowing it down more where he like maybe picked out Barbara and then he was like,
Hmm.
oh, Robert Mackle works at Deltona
Yeah,
Corporations. And then I reach out to Deltona to get their financial records. How are they doing? You know what I mean? Like pretty
exactly.
easy at this point. I mean, it's a little time consuming, but not hard.
Yeah, I mean, didn't take him long apparently. Um, and Chris had told Carmen several times that he had a dream of kidnapping someone to make a lot of money. I'm like, what a weird fucking dream, but okay. Um, and she said that he wanted to do a lot of things and he had like a lot of interest and stuff, but he was frustrated because he didn't have enough money to pursue them, which like isn't that the life struggle? That's what everyone we want to do shit and we don't have money to do it. That's what you do.
Literally,
Like,
literally. I would
God.
love to just travel for my job, but
Yeah, but
I'm
I'm
not
not
gonna
gonna
go kidnap someone.
exactly. So the week before the kidnapping, Chris had told his wife that he didn't love her anymore. He said he had a scheme to come into maybe 100,000, 500,000, maybe even $1 million. He told her he had a partner in crime that had several passports and connections to Mexico. And Chris put his wife and his two sons, again, 8 months and 2 years old, on a plane to California on Friday, December 13th, again, a few days before the kidnapping. And she moved in with her parents in California. She told the FBI she wasn't surprised about the kidnapping, just that he had done it with another woman. Like, she's like, oh yeah, like that makes sense that he would kidnap someone, but I can't believe his partner was a woman. That's what she was confused and concerned about.
Oh my God, what is your life like that you're just like, that doesn't surprise me, but I can't believe it was with a
Right.
woman. Like,
And
what?
the worst thing that this woman said, a reporter asked Carmen if she had any feelings about like the suffering of Barbara and her family, and she said, "Not really. I've thought more about what Gary went through than anything else." Girl,
What
what?
did he go
What
through? He
Gary
didn't
went
go
through?
through anything.
He
Oh, he had to
kidnapped
sell
a
a trailer
woman.
for $35. Poor guy.
Like, what?
He bought a boat.
Yeah.
Good Lord.
So, yeah. After her rescue, Barbara spent 36 hours at the Miami Heart Institute resting and receiving fluids. And later in the day, after Chris' capture, Barbara made her first and only news television appearance, which lasted 1 minute and 20 seconds. She thanked the public for their support, and Barbara wouldn't speak publicly about the crime until she helped write this book, which was published in 1971. And she's never spoken publicly about it since. Like, this was her one and only, like, I'm going to say everything I have to say, and then that's it.
Mm-hmm.
On March 5th, 1969, a fingerprint classification technician for the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation pulled an employment application for 18-year-old Donna Sue Wills. After comparing the prints, the technician realized they were a match to Ruth Eisman Shear, who showed up on the FBI's most wanted list. The Oklahoma FBI office was notified, and the FBI office in Washington gave them the go-ahead to go to the employment address listed on the application, and the employer was Central State Hospital.
I was just gonna say, can you just imagine your day being so boring as you're just comparing fingerprints, and then like you're like, oh my God, this girl's fingerprints. She's the top 10 FBI most
Right?
wanted list.
Like,
Oh,
you're
like
just
you finally get to go home to your wife and be like, I have tea. I have a story about what happened at work. Like, you know what I mean?
like you finally have a story to tell that you're like, holy shit, like this is what I've been waiting for, yeah, like you're just going like, print to print to print. Okay, great. Okay, great. And you're like, oh shit, we
nothing,
got
nothing.
something
Yeah,
here.
we got something here. Whew. But FBI agents arrived at Central State Hospital and they were able to give them Donna's home address. So when they arrived, all of her belongings were gone and she'd left notes for the landlord and other tenants telling them goodbye. Another tenant told the FBI that she might be at a local restaurant where she worked as a car hop. So agents went there and found Ruth Eisman Shear working, and she was promptly arrested for the kidnapping of Barbara Mackle. So Ruth confessed and also provided information about where she had been for the last few months. So the Thursday after the kidnapping, after the failed money drop, Ruth boarded a Greyhound bus at 2:15 p.m. to Houston, Texas. So there she worked as a live-in maid and nanny for a family for 6 weeks under a different name. So one weekend, the family had friends over and they were discussing Barbara's kidnapping because her parents had lived in Hendersonville, North Carolina, where the Mackles had a summer home. So the next day, Ruth told the family she was going to visit a friend in San Antonio and that she would be back on Monday. After arriving in San Antonio, she sent them a letter saying she had to go home to Laredo because her father had cancer. And so she was like, they're talking about this kidnapping that I was a part of. I gotta go. I gotta get out of here. So she bought a one-way ticket to Oklahoma City and checked into a YWCA on February 9th. So there she shared a room with Donna Sue Wilkes, and Ruth stole Donna's identification from her purse and went to Norman, Oklahoma, where the University of Oklahoma was. So she'd been a student for a long time, and college towns were familiar and comfortable to her. So she rented a room in a house with other students who all assumed she was also a student. So they just didn't even fact check that. They were like, I guess you're a student too.
Like,
okay.
you're young in a college town renting a room, like, yep, must be a student. Perfect.
Works out. So she told them she was looking for part-time work, and they helped her get a job as a car hop at a local restaurant. So her landlord also suggested she apply at Central State Hospital, which was a hospital for mentally ill patients, so that she could make more money. So she started working for them on February 27th. And around this time, one of the patients wandered off and didn't know his name. So it took a while to locate him. So the administrators decided that everyone, staff and patients, should be fingerprinted so that something like this wouldn't happen again. Like if somebody kind of wanders off, nobody knows who they are, they can easily figure it out via fingerprints.
Which I also thought it was wild because they mentioned that, this had happened with this patient, but they didn't want all the patients to feel like violated or like it was just like for them. So that's why they did it for patients and staff, because they're just like, oh, we're doing it for everybody to like make them not feel singled out. And I'm like, that's how this woman got caught. Like,
that's insane.
Yeah, it really is. Like, of all, because it's like normally you would think they wouldn't do that. I mean, if you're not doing fingerprints for an employment anyway, and you're already hired, but because a patient got out and then you're like, okay, well, we want to fingerprint all the patients, but we don't want to like single them out. We'll just do it for everybody. And that's when you get caught, Ruth.
So many things in this case. It's like, if you wrote this into a movie, nobody would believe it.
Right.
Like
exactly.
Them just finding the car that had absolutely everything they needed in it to a T, basically. Like,
exactly.
Just crazy. But
yeah.
So after Ruth submitted her fingerprints, she knew she had to get out of there because it wouldn't be long until her fingerprints were matched. She was like, oof, great. So she waited until Wednesday because it was payday and she needed all the money she could get before she went on the run. So she cashed her check from the hospital and then went to work at the restaurant. She also stole the purse and identity of one of the other tenants, Julie Ferguson. So Ruth made a full confession and said she and Chris alone kidnapped Barbara. She did say she was forced into it and felt bad for Barbara and wanted to be in the box with her to make sure she'd be okay, but Chris wouldn't let her. So Ruth told the FBI she met who she thought was George Deacon on the ship, and they fell in love. So they wanted to run away together, but Chris wanted them to have some money first. So he told Ruth about his plan, and on November 8th, he told her he'd chosen a victim. So sometime in December, he drove Ruth by the Mackle's house in Miami and told her Barbara's name. He showed her the box, and Ruth asked to spend the night in it to make sure Barbara would be okay. He wouldn't let her, but he did let her lie in it for like about an hour. And Ruth told the FBI she wanted to back out, but Chris said he needed her there to care for Barbara during the trip because he couldn't drive and watch her at the same time. And on December 11th, Ruth rode with Chris to leave the ransom note in the Mackle's yard. And at 12:15 a.m. on December 14th, they checked into the Roadway Inn outside Atlanta to rest. And in the morning, they checked around Emory University looking for Barbara, which this is when the professor saw them and heard them making phone calls to Barbara's dorm. And they were surprised to learn she was staying at the same motel they'd just checked out of that morning. What a coincidence.
Yeah, there's so many.
Yeah. So they left the box Chris had built in a remote area on the afternoon of December 14th. Chris also called the Roadway Inn to say he had a certified letter for Barbara Mackle. And the purpose of this letter was to make sure the hotel staff said they would ring Barbara's room. And this would let him know for sure that Barbara had checked into the hotel. So if you remember 2 hours ago and a week ago at this point for you, yes, we mentioned the certified letter and we said it was coming back and it came back. It's here.
I told you it would be at the very end of part 2, but it's here. It's mentioned. it was significant. So basically, he's like, that'll tell me for sure that she's actually there, because if not, they would be like, oh no, I'm so sorry, like there's no one here by that name. And they're like, oh yeah, like we'll
Mm-hmm.
get it to her. And he's like, got her, got her.
Got her. Got it. Yep. So on Sunday the 15th, Chris dug the hole and placed the box inside of it. On Monday the 16th, they went to Barbara's dorm at Emory to verify she wasn't there. And then they stopped for pancakes, and that's when Chris stole the policeman's hat. He also shaved his beard, since police usually don't have like beards. They're usually probably clean shaven. And at 4 a.m. on December 17th, they went to the Mackle's room at the Roadway Inn. So Ruth told the FBI she begged Chris to let her stay in Atlanta, where Barbara was buried, but he insisted she come back to Miami with him. So when they got back to Miami, he set up the box that was designed to close once the money was placed inside. So the box holding the suitcase was then supposed to fall into the water, and Chris would retrieve it with his scuba equipment. So Ruth was sent to be a lookout with their walkie-talkies, and she was supposed to let Chris know when Robert Mackle approached, or if she saw any law enforcement in the area. So when they parted ways that night for her to be on the lookout and him to retrieve the money, it was the last they ever saw each other. She radioed him when he saw the Lincoln, but then she got scared and started walking towards the Florida Bible College. She was dirty, her clothes were torn, so she stopped, bought new clothes at a thrift store, and changed clothes and cleaned up in a gas station bathroom. She also left the walkie-talkie and her binoculars in the woods, and that's when she went to the architecture firm to call the cab to the Greyhound bus station. So after this, she just got spooked. She's like, I don't want to be a part of this anymore. I'm leaving. I'm gone.
Yeah.
Ruth's bail was also set at $500,000, and she cried and fainted during the hearing. She was very distraught, but she would also like smile and laugh at times. And 2 days after her confession, Ruth wrote a letter to the Mackles apologizing. It was decided the federal government could not try Chris and Ruth for kidnapping because they didn't move Barbara across state lines, so it wasn't like a federal crime. However, they were able to charge them with violating the federal extortion statute and interstate transportation in aid of racketeering. And then the state of Georgia was able to charge them for the actual kidnapping. So have state charges and federal charges.
Mm-hmm.
Which I'm also surprised, like, you didn't charge them for how many counts of identity theft at this point?
I mean, yeah, there may have been other charges too that weren't mentioned in there, but those are the ones that they're like, okay, like related to the kidnapping, we weren't able to do this, but we were able to do this. But yeah, I would assume too that was part of it.
Yeah, you would think, I mean, based on like their sentencing a little bit, I'm like, it doesn't seem it as much, but I'm like, if you wanted to, you could just like throw the book at them. I mean, Ruth's been like 6 different people in the last 2 months.
True.
So on January 13th, 1969, a grand jury in DeKalb County, Georgia, had indicted both Chris and Ruth for kidnapping for ransom even before Ruth's capture. So Chris' attorney requested that he receive a psychiatric examination and also be tried separately from Ruth, and both motions were granted. So the psychiatric report said at times Chris wanted to talk and other times he didn't and didn't want to participate because this would be used against him. Chris thought he was very intelligent and denied any hallucinations, and it was ruled that Chris had sufficient capacity to comprehend the nature and object of the legal proceedings in which he'd be involved. So, like, even if he possibly had something going on, like, he still understands what he's being charged with and understands what he did and that it is illegal.
Mm-hmm.
They also stated he was able to aid in his own defense. So Chris went on a hunger strike and eventually stopped drinking water and collapsed, and the state ordered a glucose IV. So Gary Christ went on trial May 19th, 1969. So he weighed 235 pounds when he was arrested and weighed 174 pounds at trial after his hunger strike. So he was doing extreme hunger strike.
Yeah, he was not playing around with it.
And we're not going to explain the trial in detail too much because a lot of that information has already been covered throughout these episodes. Like, we've told you the circumstantial evidence. We've told you what happened. Like, we've kind of told you everything, and that's basically what happened in the trial.
Yeah.
But it was revealed in trial that the tranquilizers Barbara had been searching for were actually in the water she was drinking inside the box. So that's probably why the water tasted absolutely horrific.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So obviously the state had plenty of evidence against Christ. And on May 26th, after 4 hours of deliberation, the jury found Christ guilty and sentenced him to life in prison. So the death penalty was on the table, but only 5 jurors voted for death, 6 voted for life in prison, and 1 abstained from voting.
Which I looked it up because we did a deep dive on the death penalty for a recent Patreon episode, because I was like, wow, like just kidnapping, like no physical assault. I mean, you could argue obviously that she was physically harmed from being kept in a box, but it did not beat her, did not rape her, did not murder her. And I was like, wow, like kidnapping was on the table. But this was like the year that everything kind of started to like reform the death penalty. So like if this had happened like 2 years later, that would not have been a possibility. Like it was literally right at this time that everything was happening with the death penalty, like kind of being abolished for like a decade or so and then coming back. So I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, that is interesting. So Ruth Eisman Scheer went to trial on June 16th, 1969. She pleaded guilty to the lesser charge of kidnapping and was sentenced to 7 years in prison. So Barbara and her family didn't want Chris to receive the death penalty. Barbara said she actually had more empathy toward Chris than Ruth because Chris was the one who called the FBI and told them where she was. Ruth had taken off the day before and could have called and revealed where Barbara was, but she didn't. Like Ruth did have all these opportunities to come get her, to call, anything, and she didn't.
Like you were the only other person in the world. Like you, especially after her confession and everything, and she's like, I felt bad for Barbara. I didn't want to do it, all this stuff. And then you leave him, you escape, you're not in any harm being with him. You're halfway across the country by later that next day. And you're the only other person in the world who knows where Barbara is, and you didn't make any attempt to save her life.
Yeah. The second you leave him, you could have just gone to law enforcement and been like, I'll tell you where to go.
Yeah.
Barbara said she'd also trusted Ruth because it seemed like she cared, but she didn't actually do anything to help her and just felt like a betrayal. So Gary Stephen Christ was released from prison on parole after 10 years, despite a failed escape attempt in 1973. He's not changing. He's still trying to escape. So he shrimped in Alaska and then attended medical school in Grenada and Dominica and practiced as a physician in Indiana from 2001 to 2003 because Indiana law did not prevent a felon from obtaining a medical license. He did end up losing his license after failing to disclose a disciplinary action he received. So he then returned to Georgia to start a construction company with his stepson. And in 2006, he was arrested on a boat off the coast of Alabama with 30 pounds of cocaine in it.
So he's still just running on boats with shit. Like, what are you doing?
He's committing crimes left and right here. So he pleaded guilty to drug smuggling and received 5 years in prison. He was on probation until November 22nd, 2015, and Ruth Eisman Scheer was deported to Honduras after serving 4 years in prison. So Barbara graduated from Emory University in June of 1970, and she married her best friend that we mentioned, Stuart Woodward, and they had 2 children together and lived in South Florida. Stuart did die in 2013 after 43 years of marriage. And that is the just wild kidnapping case of Barbara Mackle.
Yeah. There's a lot to this one, clearly, as we are almost an hour and a half into our second episode of this case. But I hope you guys thought all of the information was worth it. Like, I've heard this one before, like a very shortened, condensed version of it. And again, the book is like 8 times.
There were definitely parts that triggered my memory. I can't remember which part it was. But like when I was reading over the notes, there was one part and I was like, I kind of remember this part. Like it sounds familiar.
But there is just so much to the story, and just like the absolutely insane, complicated like ransom note that he wrote, like his whole process for like finding her and choosing her and building this box and making sure. And again, the book, which is
83 Hours Till Dawn?
Yes, 83 Hours Till Dawn.
Oh, I cannot believe I remembered that.
Which was co-written by Barbara Jane Mackle and also Jean Miller. Again, this book has this information just, times so much more.
Plus more.
But a very good read. Like sometimes books are too like heavy with the details where it's like, okay, but like it was a very enjoyable read, and a lot of details and great information, and love that it was co-written by Barbara, so she got to tell her story again very much in detail, about her time in the box and what her family went through and everything. So highly recommend that you guys check out that book. We hope you enjoyed this story. Courtney, what is your perk of the week?
So my perk of the week is, to the surprise of no one, Crime Con.
I mean, obviously.
Just the whole weekend.
Yeah.
I mean, it's gonna be the perk of the week. It's the biggest thing that's happened in a few weeks. But no, I mean, we struggled a little bit getting there with like delayed flights and stuff, and we were like, are we gonna make it? What's gonna happen? But we got there, and it was just such a good time, and it was so nice, like just having like a girls' weekend. Like, when's the last time like the two of us took a trip with like nobody else?
Like, have we even ever? I mean, I know you've come to like visit me, so that's kind of.
Yeah, the only thing I could think is like when I come to visit and like we would then go and maybe go to like Southport or like Wilmington and stay the night.
True,
you know what I mean? But like, I mean, it has been a long time since there's been anything like that. But anyway, it was just super fun, and it was so nice to be at Crime Con, and it was so nice on Sunday to like finally get into the pool I'd been coveting at that hotel and like chill, like have a few drinks by it
every single day, because I mean these were long days, guys. Like Saturday started at 9 a.m. and ended at 8 p.m. with an hour lunch, and there were 20 minutes between each session. So like it was very like boom, boom, boom. And like every day Courtney's like, okay, well maybe after this, then we can go to the pool, and then we have dinner, and then go to the pool. And then like finally Sunday, we finished all the sessions at 3, and we had a solid 3 hours by the pool. And it was pretty glorious, I'm not gonna lie.
This pool, maybe we can post a picture when we post like everything, but this pool it was like huge and also had TVs. So like Sunday we were watching football on, like, it looked like the ones like in Vegas. Like it was just so nice. And I just kept looking, and I was like, it'd be so nice to just be sitting by that pool right now. So glad we finally got there. But the weekend in general was just really nice. It was perfect. And I can't wait for the next one. I know. So
already doing the countdown, ready to go.
Already doing the countdown. So that is my perk of the week. Jacqueline, what is your perk of the week?
I think we kind of just shared our joint perk of the week as we went back and forth discussing. Yeah. So,
This was a long episode, so we'll just have a joint perk of the week. Keep it short and simple. We've talked way too much.
Yeah, we did also start recording within like a minute and a half of logging onto Zoom, which we have never, ever done before. Yeah. But that's also because we were like
the quickest we've ever started.
Yeah. But we were also like 45 minutes late starting because my power decided to go out like 10 minutes before we were supposed to record. And we were like, okay, like what's our plan B? Because like it's a super busy week for both of us. And we're like, okay, like when are we gonna fit this in? And I was like, okay, if it comes back on by like 9:15, I think we're good to record tonight. Y'all, my power came back on at 9:14.
And then I've been over here drinking wine because I forget how quickly wine catches up to me. And then I would mess something up and I see Jacqueline muted laughing, and I'd have to be like, just keep talking. We don't have time to get to.
There was one, I can't remember what it was now, that and like I laughed so hard and you did not even miss a beat. Like you just got right back into it.
It was so hard. What was it? What was it? What was it?
You said horses instead of agents?
Yes. Yeah, he said horses instead of agents. I don't even know where that came from. Horses wasn't even in the paragraph or in the story.
Like, and so she told
I just like said it.
And so I'm muted, but I'm dying. And she's like, and she told it, and she went right back, and I'm just like, oh my god, I was stuck like, for 5 minutes on that.
I was just like, I almost literally like put my hand up like this because I could see you laughing, and I was like, we don't have time for me to laugh. I have to keep going.
Oh gosh. But the only other thing I wanted to add to my perk of the week was just a shout out to Courtney for maintaining the Patreon content schedule over CrimeCon, because like my brain was in so many different directions, but like each session Courtney's like, I gotta take a picture, I gotta write a little summary, we're gonna post it. It didn't post because the Wi-Fi and the service was terrible.
Was so mad.
Yeah, we kept trying.
I did so good with keeping up with it, and you just got everything Sunday night. But you know what? It's fine.
But it's the thought that counts. I think the first few went through, and then there was, so we gave you a little teaser, and then you just had to wait till the end of the weekend. But you know, but yeah, I just want to give a shout out to Courtney for manning that, and making sure that was taken care of. And if you guys want to tell us all the things on all the places, you guys know where we are. Again, patreon.com/caffeinated crimes if you want an hour and 45 minutes.
Another 2 hours of our voices on
who
this
wouldn't
beautiful
want that,
Tuesday.
right? All that good stuff. Yeah, I already said that. It's getting unhinged. What's next?
And if you just want to go and give us 5 stars on Spotify, on podcasts, we're on YouTube. If you want to give us likes and comments, we're going to try to start being more active on social media and on TikTok. So also, if you guys know of any active missing persons cases that you want us to post the flyer, please send those.
Yes.
We will get them posted like immediately, and maybe I'll even make like a highlights on our page of just like missing person posters, so that way it's there like permanently. But we want to start doing that and being more active in that fashion, and just kind of crime con making us realize what we're doing right, but what we could do better.
Definitely.
You know, so yeah, so you can find us on all the places, all the things, patreon.com, Caffeinated Crimes, 5 stars, and go have a cup of coffee
and don't commit a crime.